So to get started in the planning and sketching phase, we first wanted to address the types of objects and subject matter that work best for isometric illustration. Things that are geometric to begin with, such as a building, which essentially starts as a cube. Anything that's kind of rectangular or angular is going to be the easiest thing to start with. Once you start getting into more organic shapes like hills, mountains, that's a bit more challenging because it becomes more subjective how you want to treat it in your own illustration. Projects that work particularly well for isometric illustration is anything like an architectural rendering, a floor plan, a map, anything you want to see kind of an overview. And another important consideration is to think about your final application. Some of the projects we're talking about today are things like a mural that has a huge scale to it, other things small like an object going onto a can. It's important to start to think about how this is going to be used, and the sketching phase will help you figure out where to place things and how that's going to apply to your final project.
So our goal for this class is to create a simple city block, and that will include whatever you want. It could be buildings, it could be objects, it could be more of a scene that's showing water. For our purposes, we're going to try to show as much variety as possible so that you have a lot to work with. But to start off, we actually made a template that you can use that already has like a grid system so that it'll be easy to actually sketch this. So you can see with this actual piece of paper, there's very faint lines that are going in very specific angles, and that's the isometric angles. And to show you what that kind of looks like, I'm just going to draw a simple cube using these actual lines. And that is an isometric cube. Now, something like this can be used in lots of different ways. Obviously, an easy application is to turn this into a building. This is already basically a building because it's a box. What we're gonna actually do is customize from there and use this grid system to actually create what we want. So for my first object is gonna just be like a tall building. So obviously this is a little bit more shorter. So I'm just gonna erase a little bit and start customizing. So for example, I can go as tall as I want. Let's say I want a building about that tall. So that's a bit more of like a skyscraper. And if we want to customize from there, we could actually even make it a different shape other than a cube. So for instance, let's say I want it to taper a little bit and have the top be a little bit smaller. I can go ahead and kind of like play around with deleting a little bit of what I actually created and use that top, which is now smaller than its base, as a way to draw. So let's see what that looks like. And one thing to keep in mind is it's very helpful to have a ruler in this situation because you want to have all your straight lines. So I'm just going to kind of go point to point and start playing around with how things look. It kind of has a bit of more of a Freedom Tower kind of look. So now you have something that did start off as a cube, but now is obviously more of a building and a very customized building. So from there, just drawing your first object, this will help you kind of dictate like how this city block is going to work. And one thing that's important to remember with city blocks is the road system. So I'm going to go ahead and just start drawing some roads. Let's say there's a road right in front of it. And to make things interesting, I'm just going to draw a cross street. All right, so from there, let's add some detail. Let's add some sidewalking, same angle. And kind of decide what's going to go around this. So obviously I have a little bit of a area here for more buildings. Let's start drawing another cube to kind of like plan something out here. Maybe give it a little bit more breathing room here. And maybe instead of a perfect cube, I make this a little bit longer than it is wide. something like that. And you can just kind of rough it in for now. Obviously, you're going to be doing a lot of erasing too, so make sure you have a decent eraser. So what I'm going to do is now kind of delete the things that are behind this building.
And this is helpful to note at this stage of the process that your objects are going to overlap each other, so the ability to know now what's going to be hidden can provide a lot of efficiencies over time that you don't have to draw things that are eventually just going to get covered up anyway.
So I'm just going to continue making some basic shapes. Let's get a little bit more complex with this next one and try to challenge ourselves a little bit other than using just a perfect cube. So I'm actually going to start off with a cube like I normally would, but let's build it so that it has more of an interesting facade. So I'm going to actually make it more like two-tiered. I'm going to try to round its top. And you don't have to be perfect about it, but you just kind of want to try other things other than straight lines and just see if it looks good. So that building is a little bit more unique than the first two. And I'm going to kind of just start erasing the things that are behind it and so on, just polish it out from here. All right, so I basically have 3 rough building shapes. I'm gonna go ahead and start playing around with what's going on in this part of the city. If I were to just build more buildings, I'd actually start covering up what I just illustrated there. So for the sake of showing as much as possible, I'm actually gonna make this part more of like a coastline.
And you can see this technique applied in something like the mural that we did, that we're typically trying to layer the composition with taller objects in the background, shorter objects in the foreground, and that kind of opens things up to be able to see everything rather than, covering up smaller details that you might otherwise lose, depending on how you layer your composition.
And I'm just using straight lines to draw this for now, but obviously that's not how like a coastline would look. So once you have those rough areas in, you can go ahead and like delete the corners with your eraser and start rounding things out so it's a little bit more organic to what you would actually see in real life. So the process of actually illustrating always starts with something very like mathematical and straight, but you can customize based off that. So right now I have a bit more of a flowy look. And since this area right here is going to be representing water, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of rough in a boat. One way to do that is just to kind of like draw the base of the boat. And kind of imagining that it would be more like this shape, so it points in the front. So now that I have a base for a boat, I'm going to start making the 3-dimensional aspect of it. So let's kind of like build the base up and make it a little bit more 3D, and maybe make it taper a little bit so that it has a longer top than it has a bottom. I want this to also be a bit of a more interesting boat so that it has layers to it. So I'm going to actually kind of rough in a box on top. So that's kind of a rough placement of what a boat would look like. And then it's just about filling in the space from there. So I have kind of a grid system of all these different objects. Let's go ahead and maybe fill in this area with some trees. I'm just going to start off with simple circles. And I'm just going to draw in their little stumps. So I just kind of threw in some circles there for now. Obviously, we're going to get into the mathematics of, are these actual like isometric angles, and is it mathematically going to work with this actual grid system? But for now, you kind of just want to place in what you know. And for me, a basic way to throw in trees would just be a circle. You could obviously make them taller if you want to, or wider, but don't worry too much about the math at this point. The grid's there to kind of help you lay things out, but we'll be able to polish this once we actually draw it in Illustrator. So moving on to filling in the rest of the space, I think what I'm going to do is draw some sort of lighthouse right here. And you can kind of use the grid system to decide on its base. Right now, if I want it to be center, I'm actually going to just kind of draw a base of where I want it to start. And to get a circle in that base, you kind of just eyeball it, but you don't want all the sides to kind of touch. So you're kind of getting that kind of motion. And that's what a circle would look like at that angle. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but this will help you use something that's as cylindrical as a lighthouse to actually get that base started. So I'm going to start with that and start building from here. Just kind of like how this building worked. Imagine if it was rounded rather than chiseled. So from here, I'm going to kind of decide on its middle part, grow the height of the actual building from there, and then draw another circle. And now you kind of have like the skeleton of what a lighthouse is. And then I'm just going to use my ruler to do that taper. And then I'm just going to finish it off to make the top. And you can actually add the railing like this. And like all the other illustrations, I'm just going to start erasing things that are behind it so that we can actually see a true hierarchy of like what's in front and what's behind. And then lastly, it looks like there's some space on the road here. It would be probably smart to show some sort of activity, so I'm actually going to draw a car. Same thing, I'm going to start off with a base using the line work that's provided, and then same thing using the line work that's going the other direction. Basically imagine a rectangle just laying flat. So that's pretty much like how the base of a car would look, or the shadow of a car, and then I'm just going to build from there. So bringing up the vertical lines, giving a little bit more three-dimensionality like a box, and then seeing what I can do to actually make the top of the car a little bit taller than its actual base. So it's kind of like a quick and easy way to just draw something really rough, but you can kind of start to see a remnant of what a car would look like at this angle.
And one thing to note here is that kind of building these as an example, we're not worrying too much about the true scale of how big a car would be compared to a building, compared to a lighthouse. But if you were going to be using isometric illustration to build a map or a floor plan or something that you really wanted to be to scale, one nice thing about this grid system is you could use this grid to apply a scale. So let's say one square on the grid is a 1 foot by 1 foot square, or 10 by 10 feet. There are ways that you could use this to get something that's very accurate.
All right, so that's like the first steps to getting your sketch down. It's all about planning. So I basically have a wireframe of all my buildings. Now, the next thing to think about is both detail and shading or lighting. I'm gonna actually start drawing in some details just to kind of get an idea of what things would look like. So for this building, obviously I want windows. And I'm gonna try to do windows on all the buildings, but do them in slightly different ways just to kind of like give it more variety. So for this building, I'm just going to do horizontal lines. And the way that works is just using the actual grid system. So you can see with the lines that are here, I can kind of rough in what that might look like. But I can be more accurate with it by using my ruler and looking at the grid as closely as possible. So I'm just going to go ahead and draw in those lines. All right, so now that I have a general plan for the windows for this building, I'm gonna go ahead and add in the windows for this one, but let's do something slightly different. Instead of actually making them just horizontal lines, I'm actually gonna do like more of like arched windows, typical windows that you would see in a real city. So I'm going to finish off this building, which is our most complex building. I'm just going to do some quick windows in the front. But I want this arc here to actually have more of an interesting ultra large window. So I'm actually going to find its halfway point and then using the actual lines in the grid kind of build up the windows like that. And let's go ahead and actually give it more of a perimeter so it's not going wall to wall here.
Now that Dan has finished creating the skeleton of our illustration, one thing we need to consider is light source and shadow and how we want that to play a role in the final illustration. So to take a look at that, we're going to do a quick demo to look at how light source for a project like this is maybe a bit more complicated than dealing with a flat illustration.